The first sight of the American chaplains inside the camp was almost comical to the German prisoners. Men who had once marched under banners of the Reich now sat in barbed wire compounds in places like Camp Swift, Texas, or Fort Robinson, Nebraska, watching as U.S. Army chaplains walked in carrying boxes filled not with food, cigarettes, or even warm clothing, but with small, pocket-sized Bibles. The books seemed ridiculous against the backdrop of mud, fatigue, and barbed wire. A few guards passed them out with little ceremony, and the chaplains, dressed in khaki uniforms with crosses on their collars, offered gentle words the prisoners barely listened to within minutes. Laughter rippled through the rows of bunks. Some prisoners held the little books aloft, waving them like stage props, Amerikanische Märchenbücher. One sneered American fairy tales. Another, a university-educated lieutenant from Hamburg, leaned back on his bunk and chuckled to his comrades. "We studied Nietzsche and Goethe. They offer us scraps of cheap paper." His remark drew nods and louder laughter, for men trained in philosophy, science, and the hard realism of war. The fragile books seemed a symbol of weakness. To many of these POWs, the Bible represented more than religion. It was the embodiment of a system they had been taught to scorn. German propaganda in the final years of the war often mocked American faith as a form of naive superstition. In the barracks, prisoners told each other stories that circulated like gossip, that Americans believed soldiers carried Bibles to protect them from bullets, or that chaplains preached fairy tales to keep their troops docile. The men grinned as they passed the books from hand to hand, comparing them to the thick volumes of philosophy that had once lined their libraries back home. Yet even in the midst of laughter, subtle cracks appeared. One young soldier, barely 20, turned a Bible over in his hands as if curious. The pages were thin, almost transparent, the type tiny. He caught sight of a verse printed in both English and German, Psalm 23, and whispered the first line almost unconsciously. His bunkmate nudged him sharply, warning him not to be sentimental. The laughter continued louder around them, but the boy's eyes lingered on the page before snapping the book shut. The chaplains noticed the mockery but said little. They had seen it before, skeptical men, hardened by war and defeat, scoffing at the idea that paper and ink could offer comfort, instead of arguing. They simply moved quietly through the compound, shaking hands, offering a few words in German, and leaving the Bibles where they could be found later. They understood something the prisoners did not yet in the silence of the night. When the wind rattled the wire and news of the war arrived like a shadow, even the strongest voices of ridicule could falter. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And before we go further, share with us, where are you watching from, and what time of day is it right now? In the weeks that followed, the German prisoners kept up their sense of superiority. To them, the chaplains' little books were symbols of a nation built on illusions. Around the barrack stoves, where coffee substitutes brewed and gossip flowed, the men reminded each other that Germany's true strength had always been its mind, its thinkers, its scientists, its poets. The prisoners called it Geist, the spirit of intellect and discipline, something they believed no fragile scripture could rival. "Americans need myths to keep them steady," an older sergeant said one evening, drawing nods of agreement. "But we have our reason. We have Darwin, Kant, Heisenberg. Why would we cling to a shepherd's song when we know the universe is ruled by laws of science?" The barracks echoed with laughter, a kind of armor against uncertainty, for them. Faith was not just unnecessary, it was weakness, an illusion that softened men instead of sharpening them. This pride found a curious echo in their daily lives. In one camp in Oklahoma, a guard recalled how POWs requested books from Goethe and Schiller for the camp library, but left the Bibles untouched, piled neatly on the shelf as if they belonged to another world. When a chaplain passed through, speaking kindly in German about hope and forgiveness, a prisoner muttered to his comrades, "He speaks like a man to children. We are soldiers. We do not need fairy tales." And yet, the irony hung heavy. These same prisoners, once engineers and students, could not escape the fact that their country was crumbling, but rather than acknowledge despair, they leaned harder on pride, ridiculing the chaplains more fiercely, whispering that American religion was nothing but propaganda meant to tame men who lacked real culture. One diary later discovered in the archives of Camp Swift bore the line, "The Americans think their Bible gives them power. They mistake comfort for truth. We Germans do not need such illusions." The handwriting was sharp, confident, but on the next page the ink seemed rushed, as though written in agitation. The tone shifted. And yet, at night, it grows more difficult to laugh. The prisoners did not speak of this openly. In daylight, pride reigned. Around the camp kitchens, men debated mathematics, argued over Goethe's verses, and mocked the chaplain's small books as if they were children's toys. It was a theater of confidence, a mask of reason. The idea that intellect alone was enough, that was their shield. But every shield, no matter how polished, can crack when darkness presses too close. Night in the camp was a different country altogether. By day, the German prisoners carried themselves with the familiar pride of soldiers, striding between mess hall and barrack with defiant posture, speaking in loud voices to prove their strength. But once the sun fell beyond the plains of Oklahoma, Texas, or Nebraska, a heavy silence descended. The compound transformed into a hollow shell, where even the rustling of trees could sound like whispers of ghosts. The wind rattled the barbed wire fences, turning them into an eerie instrument that played through the night. Guards paced their towers with rifles slung low, boots thudding on wooden planks, and their silhouettes moved like shadows across searchlights. Inside the barracks, where men lay in rows of narrow cots, the bravado faded. Conversations thinned until only the occasional cough or the shifting of blankets broke the quiet. Even the strongest officers found the silence unnerving, for it left space for thoughts they tried to bury. One night in Camp Gruber, a storm swept in. Rain lashed the tin roofs, and gusts of wind howled through gaps in the wooden walls. The barracks creaked, and men pulled their thin blankets tighter. A private from Cologne, barely 20, his face still boyish, spoke softly, almost to himself. "At home, my mother used to read the Psalms when I was afraid." His words slipped into the air like smoke, fragile, easily lost. But those nearest him heard, and the silence grew heavier still. No one mocked him, not that night. Instead, they turned in their cots, staring at the dark, each man chasing his own thoughts. It was in moments like these that the little Bibles, once mocked as fairy tales, began to take on a different presence. Some sat untouched at the edges of bunks, their covers gathering dust. Others were hidden beneath blankets, not openly read, but not quite rejected either. The chaplains had left them like seeds, and in the long nights of fear and uncertainty, the seeds began to stir. One guard later recalled how he sometimes heard muffled voices after midnight, as if a prisoner whispered to himself. He never caught the words, but he guessed it was scripture. The POWs never admitted it in daylight. But when night pressed too closely, memory and faith, long buried under pride, returned like an old melody. The irony was not lost on history. Men who had once mocked religion as a crutch began to feel the weakness in their own bones when the silence grew too deep. And so, the camp at night became a stage for unspoken doubts. For fragile thoughts no one dared to confess openly. The barbed wire hummed in the wind, and inside the barracks, reason alone seemed too thin to hold back the darkness. The turning point came not with a sermon, nor with a sudden revelation, but with the relentless flow of news from Europe. By early 1945, word spread through the camps that Dresden had burned, that Cologne was a ruin of stone and ash, that the great cities of the Reich were being flattened one after another. In Oklahoma, the prisoners gathered near the bulletin boards where American newspapers were pinned. Even those who scoffed at propaganda could not deny the photographs of shattered streets, of civilians carrying buckets through smoking rubble at night. The images returned in dreams. Officers who once lectured about reason woke trembling in their bunks, soaked in sweat. Young privates muttered in their sleep, shouting names of wives, mothers, children. One diary found years later in Camp McAllister described the barrack nights as a chorus of nightmares, men waking to the sound of their own voices, then lying still, ashamed, listening to others struggle for breath in the darkness. The chaplains noticed the change. They no longer met defiant sneers when they walked through the compounds. Instead, eyes followed them quietly, guarded, alerted, as if waiting for something they could not yet admit. The pride that once declared we need no illusions now felt hollow. The truth was inescapable, the war was lost, their homeland scarred beyond recognition, and the certainty that had steadied them began to crack. The gossip of the camp shifted too. Where once men had traded jokes about fairy tales, now they whispered about families under fire. In one barrack, an older sergeant told how his brother's factory in Essen had been obliterated. In another, a young student confessed he had dreamt of his father walking through bombed-out streets, calling his name. The laughter that once filled the evenings had dried up. Fear crept in, not only of the war's outcome, but of the nights themselves. Men dreaded closing their eyes, knowing dreams would bring them back to burning cities. In the stillness, with only the rattling wind outside, reason felt like a thin shield, unable to protect them from the images in their own minds. And it was here, in the middle of this quiet crisis, that the chaplain's small books began to appear again, not as objects of mockery, but as fragile lifelines. Some POWs slipped them under their blankets, reading in secret. Others stared at them in the dim light, hands hovering, unwilling to admit they wanted to turn a page. The pride of intellect faltered, and the hunger for comfort, something deeper than logic, slowly returned. It happened one night without warning. A storm had passed over the plains, leaving the camp drenched in silence, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. In one of the dimly lit barracks at Camp Swift, a prisoner sat upright on his cot, trembling after another nightmare. His hands, still dirty from the day's labor in the fields, reached out almost blindly. He whispered to the guard by the door, his German thick with desperation, "Die Bibel, may I borrow one?" The request startled even his fellow prisoners. For weeks they had all scoffed, but now his voice cracked with a rawness none could ignore. The chaplain, a tall man named Captain John Reynolds, walked forward. He did not lecture, nor smile with triumph. He simply placed a worn Bible in the prisoner's shaking hands. The kerosene lamp on the table flickered, casting shadows across the walls. As the young man traced the embossed cross on the cover, his fingers quivered as he opened the first page. The sound of thin pages turning was louder than the storm outside. Some prisoners turned their backs, embarrassed. Others stared, unable to look away. The boy read haltingly in German from Psalm 91, the words of protection against terror at night. His voice was fragile, but steadying with each verse. Men who had once laughed felt their throats tighten. No one interrupted. It was not just one man. Within days, more prisoners began to ask. A lieutenant who had mocked the chaplains most fiercely was spotted at dusk, sitting alone under the barrack window, his lips moving silently over a verse. A sergeant folded a scrap of paper into the Bible, marking the page he returned to night after night. Slowly, the small books once dismissed as American fairy tales were becoming anchors in a sea of despair. In later testimonies, chaplains recalled this transformation as one of the most striking contrasts of their service. They saw proud men, armed once with rhetoric and reason, humbled not by American power but by their own nightmares. And in the quiet glow of a lamp, the Bible shifted from a symbol of weakness to a vessel of survival. Viewers, pause for a moment. Imagine being trapped in a dark wooden barrack, the wind howling through barbed wire, with nothing but a thin book to hold against your fear. Would you have reached for it or held on to pride instead? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By the spring of 1945, the change inside the camps was impossible to ignore. The chaplains still made their rounds quietly, but now their presence no longer sparked ridicule. Instead, when Captain Reynolds or Father Thomas entered the barracks, a strange hush fell over the room. Conversations broke off mid-sentence, dice games stilled, and even the guards noted how men sat upright, waiting. One night in Camp Gruber, the chaplain began to read aloud. His voice was steady, low, carrying the cadence of someone who had spoken these words 1,000 times before. It was not a sermon, not even an argument, just a passage from the Psalms. Words about shadows and protection, about valleys and fear. The men who had once laughed sat motionless, listening. A few closed their eyes. A sergeant clasped his hands so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The silence was not comfortable. It pressed against the walls, heavy as the storm winds outside. But it was different from the silence of fear. This was a silence of listening, of fragile surrender. Guards at the doors later recalled that even they felt uneasy, as if they were intruding on something private, something sacred. In the following weeks, such moments multiplied. Instead of loud debates about Nietzsche or Goethe, the barracks after lights out held murmurs of prayer. Men who once competed in defiance now competed in secrecy. Who could recall a verse? Who dared ask the chaplain for another reading? Some POWs fashioned crude bookmarks from cigarette cartons, sliding them into passages they returned to each night. The numbers told a vast story. Over 371,000 German prisoners were scattered across the United States by 1945. Factories roared, farms harvested, railways thundered, all powered in part by POW labor. But in the barracks, those sweeping statistics shrank to something small and quiet. It was a single lamp burning, a single chaplain's voice rising, 100 men breathing in silence. One chaplain wrote in his field notes, "Never meant for public eyes, they mocked at first. Now, when I speak, they sit like boys in a classroom, not prisoners of war. It is not victory that silences them, it is fear, and the search for something to hold in the dark." And so the camp became a paradox. Men who once defined themselves as conquerors sat behind barbed wire, gripped not by chains but by nightmares. And the very object they despised, a thin pocket Bible, was the only thing that seemed to speak to their fear. Viewers, I want to hear from you. Do you think faith in such moments is weakness or the deepest kind of strength? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters more than you realize. The war ended in May 1945, but for the men behind barbed wire in America, the nights of fear lingered long after the guns fell silent. News of Germany's surrender arrived with mixed reactions: relief that the bombing was over, despair that their homeland lay in ruins, and uncertainty about what awaited them upon return. Yet, in the barracks, there was something else, a memory that clung more tightly than defeat itself. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, former POWs spoke not of the mockery they once voiced, but of the night the laughter stopped. One recalled, "We had scoffed, we had ridiculed, but in the hour of dread, it was that little book which steadied our trembling hands." Another, a former officer, admitted he had hidden a chaplain's Bible under his pillow, ashamed to let others see, yet unable to sleep without it near. The image of those small pocket Bibles remained etched in their memory, thin, almost fragile. They had seemed powerless in the daylight, yet in the darkness of the barracks, they became something else, a shield against nightmares, a bridge back to mothers, wives, and children who once whispered prayers at home. The irony was sharp men who boasted of Nietzsche and Goethe had, in the end, found solace in verses written centuries before, words they once dismissed as fairy tales. One chaplain later wrote that he never tried to convert the prisoners, never forced the book upon them. He simply left it where they could reach it, knowing that fear has a way of softening even the hardest armor of pride. The proof lay in the silence that followed his readings, a silence so profound that even the guards, leaning against their rifles, felt its weight. And then came the return home. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic, back to cities scarred by bombs and families altered by loss. Yet many carried something else, small Bibles, tucked into coat pockets or hidden inside knapsacks. They had begun as objects of ridicule, but they sailed back as relics of survival. The symbolic image is this: a wooden table in a darkened barrack, the wind seeping through cracks in the wall. On it lies a small Bible, pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breath, once mocked as weakness. It now sits as the last companion of men who learned that fear can strip pride bare, and sometimes only fragile words can hold back the night. History remembers wars and numbers 6 million prisoners taken, hundreds of thousands transported across oceans, entire cities reduced to rubble. Yet beneath those vast statistics lie nights that cannot be measured, nights in which men lay awake in wooden barracks, listening to the wind against barbed wire, clutching a book they once ridiculed. The story of the chaplain's Bible in American POW camps is not one of triumph or conversion, but of contradiction. German officers who once laughed at scripture discovered, in silence, that fear does not respect philosophy, nor can pride hold back the tremors of the soul. What once seemed a fairy tale became, in the rawest hours of the night, the only voice that spoke to their condition. In those fragile moments, a book of paper and ink became heavier than steel. We must remember that history is not only the clash of armies, but also the quiet turning of pages in the dark. The diaries and testimonies left behind tell us that strength is not always found in victory, nor weakness always in surrender. Sometimes. The deepest courage is simply admitting the need for comfort. The Bible in those camps did not erase despair, but it gave frightened men a way to endure it. One verse at a time. And so we are left with the image, a single pocket Bible on a wooden table, pages stirring in the night breeze. Around it, silence. Beyond it, wire and watchtowers. But within it, a refuge. The prisoners carried that memory back to a broken Germany, proof that even in captivity, humanity can find fragile shelters in words older than the war itself.